Hello Year 12 Geographers, it's Mr. Brennan here, and I've put together this walking talking PowerPoint for you to be able to provide yourself a little bit of feedback for your paper 3 mock exam, which you should have just done. The aim of how this works is that you should be able to use it along with the resources that I've uploaded for you, such as the examiner report and the mark scheme, to make some improvements this week on your paper 3 mock exam and to develop your understanding of how to access the best marks on this paper. Paper 3, just to give it some context, is really important. It is all skills based, because if you've revised well for paper 1 and you've revised well for paper 2, then actually you don't need to know anything new for paper 3. You get a resource booklet, as you've seen, and all the information that you need is primarily in that. The biggest trick is knowing how to answer the questions, and there are some set structures which again you should have access to in the structure answer sheet that I typed and provided for you. Now obviously when I set this last week, I wanted you to have a good go at this exam. It is going to be 20% of your final A-level mark, a significant proportion, and historically a paper that people who get the top grades do really well on, and therefore it's really vital. It is worth noting that the topic is different every year, so you get a fresh resource booklet. We don't see it in advance, so you go into the exam effectively not really knowing what the exam's about. That's not a problem though. What I asked you to do this week was to spend an hour looking at the resource booklet and to think about highlighting players, attitudes and actions, futures and uncertainties, because they're the 3 themes that continually run through this paper. It's almost always going to end up with you having to reach a judgment. So that's really important for you to remember, in the same way that your GCSE paper had you having to reach a judgment. While you use this to improve your already completed paper 3 mock exams, be assured that myself and Mr. Voice will be marking your answers, giving you some marks and giving you a grade that you will have achieved. But hopefully this video will help you to highlight where you needed to develop your answer, so that actually you can personally find ways to improve it. And that will be this week's task, is for you to produce a piece of reflective work on what you need to work on, what you did again, what you changed, what you improved, and a little bit of understanding to be shown about paper 3. I'm going to break this video into 2 sections, and the first section is going to be actually taking you through the resource booklet. I gave you an hour for this simply because I wanted you to get it right. In the exam you recommended 15 minutes. Seems a really short time frame, but actually I'm going to take you through it in the same way that I think you should go through it in the exam, and you'll see that you don't really need to do that much with it in the first place. What I wouldn't ever do is read the exam questions before looking in the resource booklet. You start looking for answers straight away. The best way to do it is to have a look at the resource booklet and just make sure you understand what it's showing you. You don't have to use all of it to be successful, but you have to use a lot of it, because in this exam there's a third of the marks available just from using the resource booklet and information that is in it. So basically a third of the marks, if you accurately copy, is a nice way of looking at it. So let's have a look at the resource booklet then. If you've got this in front of you, that will be great. If you haven't, pause the video, find it, open it up on your phone or another device, or if you've got a paper copy, that's even better, and have a think about how you annotated your resource booklet, and I'll take you through. What I will say is I might miss certain things in the resource booklet that you pointed out. It doesn't mean that you're wrong, it just means that I'm picking out some of the points that will stand out to me. Section A is always going to be introducing it. You see it's got the title Contrasts and Challenges in Southeast Asia, so we already know roughly what this is going to be about. It tells you about a free trade bloc. We know what they are, we know the EU, and I will be making sure that I highlight these key terms. It tells you who the founder members were, tells you what its aims were initially, and then it tells you that it's grown over time, as both in terms of the number of countries involved in this and the aims as well. Interestingly, it does tell you that one of the new aims is to act as a counterbalance to neighbouring superpowers China and India. They're not part of this trade bloc, and that might be something in the wider geography that I might just put a little question mark. But think about this: what might that be suggesting? But ultimately, on that first page, there is nothing that really you have to do other than highlight the key terms and make sure you understand what a trade bloc is. The worry would be is if you read the first sentence and thought, I don't know what a free trade bloc is, but I'm sure none of us are in that position. Next page, again, it's just understanding graphs really, and it talks about some of the inequalities between the countries within the trade bloc, and it talks about it in terms of three things there on those graphs. It talks about education, health, and governance. We know all three of these things. We can see there are big inequalities between countries in terms of education, health, and governance. We can see the world average. I'd highlight that. And basically, we can understand that clearly there are differences between these countries. They might be part of the same trade bloc, but they're all very different. It also does talk about complex histories, colonial times. We should know what colonial times means. Physical barriers, that would be things like oceans, seas, mountain ranges, deserts, and basically highlights that there are these social, economic, and political differences between the 10 states. It then goes on to give you a little bit of written information, and again, with the written pieces, what I would do is I'd read through and I'd highlight the key bits, the things that I think are important. It talks about globalization and how these different countries rank. It talks about corruption. It talks about the Gini coefficient for wealth inequalities, and that's quite important. It talks about variations between urbanisation, and we know, we go back to GCSE knowledge here, and what do we know about urbanisation? Well, we know that urban areas tend to be more developed, so countries that have urbanised have industrialised and therefore are probably more developed. It talks about links to global markets, becoming economic centres, just some key ideas, just things to read, understand, and make sure there's nothing there that you don't quite get. You will always get a map, and they are often overly complicated. Here it tells you the interconnections between the 10 countries that are involved. And it talks about infrastructure being improved to improve the connectivity. This has been done through funding from World Bank, so clearly loans are involved. Interdependencies have grown. And again, there's interconnections and interdependencies are terms that you should have seen in globalization. Also mentions local superpowers as well, India and China, and how they've been involved in this region and they've been investing in this region. So that's quite interesting. A multimodal corridor, we should have known what that is, but again, if we don't, that's not the end of the world. It's one term. We should never panic, and we should never look at it and think, I don't know what that is, this is going badly. It's not that case. It talks about some places being switched off still, and you'll have looked at that as well. Section B moves on to trade, and obviously we would have expected it to have moved on to trade. Got two figures, and again, all I'd do here is I'd make a very quick bullet point. What do these show? So figure 4, for example, is the main trading partners within the bloc. So within itself is about a quarter. You can see that China is the second biggest individual country, and then EU, Japan, USA, others. There's nothing you can really highlight here other than making sure that you do understand it. It does, however, tell you that it has established trade without tariffs with China. They're not part of the trade bloc, but they have established tariff-free trade. So that's worth making note of there. There's always something, and that's why it's important to read every single bit. Figure 5 tells you who these countries trade with mostly. A very, very busy looking table, and often students can find themselves spending far too long looking at something that actually doesn't have any great complexity or need to be looked at for more time than a quick glance to see, do I understand what it shows? The next two, we need a bit of wider geographical understanding being applied. So figure 6 talks about the share of foreign direct investment received by these countries. Clearly Singapore's got nearly 50% of all FDI, and we should know what foreign direct investment is, people. We should know that is money invested from other governments, nations, IGOs, or even TNCs. What we do know is that FDI is generally higher in countries that are more developed and with a bigger market and with more resources. So what we can work out here is that there's clearly a reason to invest in Singapore, less so into Laos and Brunei. We can see that some of those countries there, we've got greater investment, and we might think about places like Indonesia and Thailand, and TNCs investing in places like that. Again, you'll see that's just wider geography knowledge that you should have, that you should be able to think of when you see this. Figure 7 talks about the average expenditure on research and development as a percentage of GDP. Research and development is generally quaternary nature type jobs. We know quaternary jobs from GCSE, so we kind of know what that entails. Science research, medicinal research, that kind of work that's going on. Where that percentage is highest, we would expect the country to be the most developed. So again, we see Japan, South Korea, China and India. They're not in this trade bloc, but they are 4 of the top 5. Singapore clearly stands out within the trade bloc, so clearly got a percentage of research and development, suggests greater levels of development. If your country is not involved in research and development, you're probably involved in manufacturing. So if we look down that list of Brunei, Laos, Cambodia, Indonesia, Myanmar, Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, they're probably all nations where you've got a greater extent of manufacturing going on in terms of TNCs being involved there. And if it's not manufacturing, even down to primary sector jobs, I would imagine that there'd be a lot of emphasis and reliance on subsistence farming and agriculture of one kind or another. Again, that's just a bit of wider geography knowledge that you should have, that you should be able to just make a quick note of and move on. It's there for a reason. What does it show? Section C, I would imagine that most of you might have found tricky because you haven't covered superpowers yet with Mr. Voice. It's not overly complex though, and what this is basically talking about is that the South China Sea in that region, and you can see it marked on the map, and you can see some of the countries of this trade bloc, is one of the busiest in the world, but it's also one of the most contested. These are those conflicts, those attitudes and actions, and those uncertainties. You can see that China claim all of it in terms of the islands, and there's reason for that. You'll see their boundary that they decided should be put in place in 1947 takes into account the oil fields and also some of the other nations itself. It pushes right onto the border of other countries. It clearly is going to lead to some forms of conflict and disputes. Clearly the trading links as well are important, not just the oil and gas fields, because trade is huge in terms of growing an economy. So this is about a contest for contested land, or in this case it's for a contested sea. Section D is something we're much more aware of. Your figure 9 is basically showing you which countries are disaster hotspots and to what extent. So we can see that 2 of these countries are, and we should know of them anyway, in Indonesia and the Philippines, are significant disaster hotspots, but so are Myanmar and Vietnam and Thailand. So we kind of can see that there are a lot of risks to certain countries. Important to point a few things out. Firstly, what is the risk? How big is that risk? So you might have 3x's for a landslide, but landslides are on a local scale. I'd rather have 3x's for a landslide than 3x's for a volcano, which could be on a much more wide scale, and equally for tsunamis and for tropical storms. So you have to have a little element of thinking about, okay, so which of these events might be the most significant? But the key point is how those natural hazards make this region vulnerable, and they're listed for you 1 to 4 above. Things like being reliant on agriculture and natural resources, poverty still high. We should be thinking there straight away, cycle of loss and recovery. We should be thinking about Damage to agriculture. Well, agriculture is most likely to happen on fertile land. Where do we find fertile land? We find it at the bottom of volcanoes. And we also know that a large proportion of the population and economic activity is along coastlines, so we think tropical storms. And they're the connections that we should start to make. Finally, with all environmental considerations, we think climate change. And here, the map, figure 10, it shows you, firstly, two things: that there is a risk or increased vulnerability because of climate change, but that risk and that vulnerability is not uniform. What that means is it's not the same in each place. If you look at the difference between Thailand and the Philippines in terms of its vulnerability, they are different. Some places are at risk more than others. It gives you some ideas about rises in sea level will affect Jakarta, Bangkok and Manila. It tells you about the countries that rely mostly on things like agriculture. And we know that those are the countries we can think about going back and looking at that amount invested in research and development, and we can think about the foreign direct investment and how that links to what type of jobs people might be having there, and we can start to work out which countries might be most vulnerable because of that. So that's the resource booklet. I'm just going to give myself 30 seconds just to have a quick drink of water, and then we'll start looking at the questions. If at this point you think I could probably have done with going through that resource booklet a bit more, feel free to pause this and go back to the resource booklet. Did you understand everything? Did you really do the things that maybe you thought, or didn't think about the links? Maybe you didn't put those in. Give me 30 seconds, I'll be back and I'll talk you through the questions. Hello again. So, at this point, in the real exam, you'll have had 15 minutes to do that. I think I probably have taken about the same. So, in those 15 minutes, it's given you a taster, a feeling for what they might be sort of asking you, but you don't know exactly what they're going to ask you. And this is fine at that point. You don't really need to. You should be able to develop a sense of confidence at this point, though, because if you've understood 90% of what the booklet is providing you information on, and actually you are pretty much ready to go. That's plenty. So let's have a look at the questions. It's broken down into 6 questions, or 7 if you include 2A and 2B. And the final 2 questions are clearly the heavier weighted. There's an 18 and a 24 marker. I always suggest doing these in the right order, though, and being strict with your timings on these, because it's really key that you do finish. If you are the sort of human being that finds yourself running out of time in exams frequently, then you do the 18 marker first, and then you do the 24 marker, then you do the 2 8 markers, and then you do the 3 4 markers. We'll talk about this again prior to the exam, but it is vital that the 24 and the 18 marker are done, but equally you give yourself time to do the 4 and 8 markers because they are easier. Therefore, you will pick up more marks. I'm going to go through this one in order, so in sequential order, and talk you through the marks. Like I've said previously, I'm not talking about individuals here. I'm talking about general themes, general ideas, general ways to approach the paper. For this section, I think the mark scheme in front of you and the examiner's report is really useful. So if you haven't got that at this point, pause it, find it, get it, and hopefully that will be of use. So, question 1. You don't even need the resource booklet. You shouldn't do anyway. You should be able to do this question from your prior learning when you've done globalisation. You should thoroughly know why national governments are keen to join free trade blocs. You should understand the idea of growing the economy, tariff-free trade, free movement of people. You should understand how it works in the EU, and you should have examples of how that's happening. And it's all AO1 knowledge. To pick up 4 marks here, you literally have to make 4 points. What I would encourage you to do here is have a look at your own answer, but use the mark scheme. The mark scheme is better than the examiner's report for this. It's got a range of examples of how you pick up the 4 marks really, really easily. I have got an example from the examiner's report, and it is pretty difficult to read in places, but I'll have a go. So many national governments have been keen to join free trade blocs for economic growth. Bit vague, but we'll give it a mark there. Joining a free trade bloc means that the nation can create trade deals with their peers. Peers I'm not overly keen on. Creating the potential for tariff-free trade, free movement, allowing them to grow economically as they can control how resources more efficiently and at a lower cost, and mitigate economics with peers and attract FDI, and it starts to waffle. It really hasn't done that great. It's 2 out of 4 for me, and the examiner does agree with me, because it does give the idea that joining a trade bloc will increase trade, and then the idea about FDI might get you another mark for integrating economies, but it doesn't really explain why. It doesn't go on to explain why tariff-free trade is likely to boost trade and that positive multiplier effect kind of idea. And it doesn't involve any sort of concept of growing the economy so that you move into tertiary and quaternary sector development. Have a look at your answer, have a look at the mark scheme, and just think, did I really answer this properly? You should have 4 sentences that are all connected, and that should be how you pick up your 4 marks here. Question 2, some quick maths. So, ain't no excuse here that you should be able to get all 4 of these marks. How you do that is pretty straightforward. So if you look at the size of the economy in GDP, US billions, and the population in millions, and then you've got GDP per capita in US dollars, what we know is that actually the GDP per capita is per person, and therefore that population size in millions, you multiply the GDP per capita by the population, and that should equate the size of your economy. So if you were to multiply 40,500 by 0.4 million, you will get 16.2 billion. The same as if for Malaysia you were to multiply 10,545 by 29.7 million, you will get 313.2 billion. So all you do for Thailand is you reverse that backwards, and you, rather than multiplying the size of the economy, you divide it, So 5781 divided by 67 will give you your answer. The next 2 marks are just adding up, which is really straightforward, and then you do the same function for the final total. So you should get this. As I said, you'll have 5781 divided by the 67, which gives you your 387.3. When you add those up, you get 2397.8. When you add up the second column, 625.4. And when you divide those two and multiply by 1,000, you will get 3834.0. 4 easy marks. Okay. These are the basic maths questions that you should be able to do with your GCSE math skills. The next question, again, I think is one that you can do from old GCSE knowledge, and you don't need the resource booklet. But explain why the GDP per capita for the ASEAN trade bloc may be a misleading statistic. Well, if we think about it, we know why GDP per capita is misleading or not entirely accurate. We can talk about how it masks inequalities in wealth. We should then link that probably to the Gini coefficient, which doesn't do that. We can talk about how it's for the whole trade bloc. We've got extremities, and I think I haven't got the data directly in front of me right now while I talk, but was it Singapore and Brunei have got massively high GDP per capita compared to some of the other countries. So we should kind of know these answers. And again, with the examiner report, there's one that got 4 marks. What I want to highlight here is actually look at how much this candidate has written to get those 4 marks. It doesn't have to be a massive essay. This is succinct and to the point. So equally what it does though, it uses examples to back it up, and this paper is all about using examples. So with the example, with using the Gini coefficient, with talking about misleading as it hides inequalities, it really does just about get those 4 marks. Again, use the mark scheme, look at your answer. Whereabouts do you think you're sitting? What didn't you do? What do you need to do better? Because this paper, you need to really think at A level. If it's 4 marks, I'm not getting it for 1 sentence. Okay? Your next 2 questions are 8 mark analyse questions, and these are lovely because these are 4 marks of AO1, which is developing points in your knowledge, and 4 marks for AO3. Now, AO3 at A level is more about using the source on this paper. So you get 4 marks for picking out information from the sources that you've been given. You then get another 4 marks for identifying or explaining those data sources to the question. I've put down the structure there that there should be 3 points. I think that's the minimum. I think 4 is ideal because 4 points or 4 uses of the source should guarantee you that you will get 4 AO3 marks, and if you explain them well and link them to the question, you'll get the 4 marks for the AO1. What I do like to see here is a lot of double development, so all of your A-level answers should be littered with furthermores and building on this and the connectives like that show that you're not just happy to make 1 point, you want to develop that point further. You should have had this structure in front of you as you attempted the first one of these questions, and again I think this is a really easy A-level question. So studying table 1 on page 4 and figure 2 in section A, analyse the differences in their social, economic and political development. Well, social, we've got education and health. Economic, we've got GDP, and political development, we've got governance. You've got loads of data. Even if you just did a social, economic and political mini paragraph, you would probably get enough to pick up level 3, 7 or 8 marks. Clearly analyse the differences. Well, Brunei, Singapore, 55,167 and 4,500 for the GDP compared to Cambodia, compared to Myanmar. You can talk about range, you can talk about those in the middle as well. Malaysia is somewhere in the middle. But generally, if you look at that, it really is masking it, isn't it? Brunei and Singapore really is masking it. You go to social and you can talk about education and health, and you can start to talk about how Cambodia's got the lowest life expectancy by nearly 18 years against Singapore. Brunei 78.1 as well, and that matches with the GDP, and you can talk about how that would be maybe tax, and you start to really develop these points about how they're linked together. Same with education, and for politically as well, you can talk about the rule of law. You should be using the world averages on those 3 graphs as well, so you can say how some places are actually above the world average and others are below, but there's a significant range. Have a read of this answer. I'm not going to read this one out to you, but have a read of this one first. You might want to pause it and then have a quick read. Okay, so if you've unpaused it, do the same for this one. I mean, immediately, I'll give you a clue. If you look at the amount of data in those first 4 lines, immediately you should have a sense of where this is going. Again, pause this. Okay, using the mark scheme and using your own answer, just have a quick think before I move on to the next slide. What marks would you give for this or for these two answers? I'll let you pause it again. Write your two answers down. Let's see how close you get. Okay, so for this one, it's used some of the data. It's made some links. It's talked about Singapore versus what was the other country it used? Singapore is the highest and the most developed, but it doesn't use a wide range. I think is it Malaysia? It uses Laos. Laos, however. So that was a nice study for limited development, limited use of the data, and the sort of thing that would leave me frustrated as your teacher, because I'd sit and say to you, you've got all that information they're giving you, all the data they've given you, and you've used two or three pieces really basic and briefly. This answer, however, I'd be patting you on the back and I'd buy you a drink. That is brilliant. Look at it. It's got all the data in it. It's got development. What I really like is if we look at line 4, as a result, Singapore as a tertiary quaternary sector in the economy, while Myanmar has probably got farming in the primary sector. They don't know that. That information has not been given to them. But they've really kind of inferred, they've understood the data, and they're starting to make these really nice developments. It talks about how differences in governance, it talks about differences in healthcare, it talks about colonies historically, so historical factors. It's starting to pull information from elsewhere. I think that's a really brilliant answer, and in fact I think that's way more than you actually really need for level 3. But if you can write like that and you can do that in 8 minutes, then there's no reason why not. What I think happens there is that somebody starts writing that answer who's really well prepared. They start writing that answer, they use the data, and what they do is they find themselves almost in a natural flow using better geography to back up their points. Examiner agrees with me, and it's a full 8 out of 8. There's another 8-mark question. I think this one is the first one where I think, oh, this is a little bit trickier, but that's mainly because it's such a complicated map and such a busy map, really, to use. So figure 3, which is here, analyse the varied level of interconnectedness within the trade bloc. Again, I think we have to think about connectedness here in terms of we've got railways and we've got roads and we've things like that. That's fine, but we've also got things like rivers. We need to bear that in mind for transportation. But connectiveness could also be they're giving you gas pipelines, oil pipelines, and electricity here as well to think about. Like I say, I think this is the hard question of the smaller questions, and I think it's what I call the A-star question. It's the question where it divides those candidates that might get the A in the end with the candidate that gets the A-star because they managed to do this question really well. Have a read of this answer. So pause this, have a read. Okay, what mark are you going to give that? Just write it down, use the mark scheme. So pause this again, use the mark scheme. What mark are you going to give that and why? So it got 5. You'll notice, and I'd be happy with 5 on that one, you'll notice that actually it does the hard work, and the examiner makes the point here. It talks about the understanding and the processes and the connectiveness, but the AO3 is neglected. It doesn't use the map. It doesn't use the data. It would be so frustrating to find that you got 5 out of 8 rather than 7 out of 8 because you haven't just basically copied some things down from the booklet. A tricky question though. Now we get to our final 2 questions. And what I'm most concerned with at this point is that for the 18 and the 24 marker, we get structures right and we think about how to do these questions well. They're not that much different from the 20 markers or the 12 markers that you get in paper 1 and paper 2. It's just that you've got a lot of sources that you can use for this here. You'll see that the common words are to what extent, assess the importance, strengths and weaknesses, things like that, significance, evaluate. So that's how you actually work out what are the questions asking you to do. But as always, your introduction. So one sentence defining what's this question about. Then 3 or 4 sentences that set your stall out. What are you going to talk about? What are your 3 or 4 paragraphs going to be about? We've done this before with the tectonics work where you've looked at what's the factor and what could the other factors be. And I think that's really important to do. Then you do a minimum of 3 paragraphs, 4 if you can for the 18 marker. And for each one of those, it follows the very, very obvious structure of point. So what's your introductory point? What's your knowledge? What are you saying? What's your argument? Evidence. Back it up from the resource booklet, because on the 18 marker, there's 6 marks available for using the sources. 6 marks for lifting information out of that resource booklet to back up your argument. Explain it, an argument. For the EA, I would possibly sometimes now use the words double develop, because once you've explained it, I'd like you to then furthermore develop it that extra little further bit. Then link it back to your own knowledge again, and then back to the question. Then start your next paragraphs. You should have been able to do this really well in this mock paper, because I asked you to use this information with you at that time. So, a whole range of information now though, section B and section C of the resource booklet. Evaluate the role of superpowers in the development of Southeast Asian region. I would expect us not to have done as well in this section as the others, because we haven't done the superpowers work. However, I think you still could have had a good go at the structure and picking information out from the resource booklet. For this task, there were 2 answers in the examiner report. One got 13 out of 18, one got 18 out of 18. I want you to read these and the examiner's comments and see how your answer compares. Have a look at the mark scheme. Do you understand? And more importantly, look for that structure. It might not be the exact structure that I've just asked you to do, but it will do a lot of these things really well. It will make points. It will use evidence to back it up. It will explain it. It will double develop it. It will build on arguments. It will use some of their own wider knowledge. Pause the video and give yourself some time to do that. Okay, so this is what the examiner did say about it, and I'm not going to read it all because that would take too long, but you can read this as well by pausing it. But I think it only has a few marks allocated to AO1, which is largely taken up from definitions, and that's all fine. What you needed to do was to consider there were many ways that superpowers had impacted on development, and then identify what they were. It says that most candidates use figure 4, 5 and 6 well. That's really important because that's trading connections with superpowers. They made a good contrast with the higher intra-EU trade to emphasise the importance of extra-ASEAN trade. The AO3 was done well. However, a lot of them didn't get beyond level 2 because AO2 was weak. That's the explanation part. That's the double developments. That's linking it back to the question. That's about finding the points that actually show the influence of these superpowers and explaining why that is the case. Have a read through this, pause it, have a look at what it tells you, and then we'll move on. Okay, welcome back. Finally, is the 24 mark question at the end. 8 marks for using sources, 12 marks for explanation, 4 marks for basic definitions and key terms. You should get that in your introduction. So this question was, evaluate the view that climate change and natural hazards pose the most serious threat to economic, social and political stability of Southeast Asia. Evaluate the view. What you need to be doing is almost thinking about the way we did the tectonics questions. because does climate change, in this sense, does it pose a threat? Do natural hazards pose a threat? Well, they do. They pose a threat economically, socially, and politically. But are they the only threat? And this is where you have to really think about it. Paragraph 1 and paragraph 2 here, you could probably argue one paragraph on climate change, one paragraph on natural hazards, and you've got all that information for you. 3 and 4 needs to be what other factors could it be? So you need to think about what else is there in this booklet that I can use, or from my wider knowledge, that might say why. Interestingly as well, with the question, you might say that actually economically and socially they're the biggest threats, but politically it might not be that, and actually politically it probably is the role of China. Now, it sounds like it's a really complicated way of doing things again, but actually if you really think about structuring this first and you know what you're going to write about, you shouldn't find this that difficult. One paragraph, like I say, is definitely on climate change. One is definitely on natural hazards. One will probably be on superpowers. What's your fourth? Where are you getting that from? In each paragraph, you should talk about economic, social and political, reaching judgments the whole way through, and it should all be backed up by data. There are 2 answers in the examiner's report. Again, I want you to go to those. I want you to read them and see how your answer compares. Use the mark scheme. Have a look at it. One got 13 and one got 20. 20 out of 24 is exceptional on this question. Go to those, have a read, and see what mark you give. Again, once you've done that, I want you to read, this is in the examiner's report as well. It talks about what I've just tended to mention. It talks about how climate change and natural hazards really are quite significant. It talks about how your prior learning could be applied to this. It talks about how you might use ideas of mitigation and adaptation and how it might not be so significant. Ultimately, why are some countries affected more by natural disasters than others? Well, this is only our tectonics knowledge, isn't it? Have a read through this again and think about how it might have made you answer the question differently or approach it in a different way. So, to summarise, I don't expect you to have done this perfectly. I expect you to have had a good go at it. You don't have to have got full marks to get the highest grades. But what you do need to do is understand how you write those questions, how you answer those questions. You have to have revised well to have done this well, and you have to use those resource booklets really well. So this week's task is to use all this information and the examiner report and the mark scheme to make some thoughts, improvements on what you've done originally. Look out for the feedback in terms of your individual grade from myself and Mr. Voice as the week goes on. We will get through those and give you some feedback. But ultimately, what I want you to produce just this week, it's a very small task, is I'd like you to write no more than one side of A4. Your reflections on paper 3. What do you need to work on? What is it that you think you can do well at this point? What is it you think you need to do better? It's a tricky paper in that actually all the answers are there for you. You've just got to filter through it. If that could be uploaded by the end of this week, that would be great, and we'll be able to then have a read through and think about where we go. Any questions, as ever, feel free to be in touch. You're all very quiet at the moment, so I'm assuming that everything's going well. But be in touch and take care, stay safe, and look out for next week's work. Okay, hope this has helped. If you have any thoughts on whether this has helped, listening to me talk through things rather than just having the PowerPoints, let me know. Be interested to have some feedback. Take care then, folks. Thanks.